Okay, going to begin. Welcome to Dis and Dat, 23 May. Going to talk about the financialization of housing. Ultimately, it's more about land rent, but we're covering the hits, the major authors on this kind of issue, because it is the thing that I'm fiddling around with. Is something that relates to land economics, ultimately land rent financialization. Housing is one component of that in terms of estimating rent. But as you discovered the other day, aside from yesterday when I was doing something else, um, you might consider the idea that financialization covers many sins and that it is not simply the idea of ground rent, but the larger question of rent in general, the thing that has been described by more conventional economists as rent seeking. But the fact of the matter is, we're always sort of rent seeking. Ultimately, that is the kind of that underlies the value question. So anyway, today I'm going to look at Albers and Hyla, that is Manuel and On, and the piece that this represents in Urban Studies, this journal article, is simply a conversation between Manuel and An, and talking about recent books. But it also connects to a larger set of articles, which is also attached, and I'm not going to probably get to that, or maybe we will. We'll see. A conversation about land rent, financialization, and housing, Manuel Albers and Hyla in Urban Studies 2016. It's a double review. Their debate focuses on issues such as comparative research, a political economy approach to urban studies, and topics of interest such as land rent, financialization, housing property states, path dependency, regulation, and the role of the state. In the financialization of housing, Albers asserts the centrality of housing to the contemporary capitalist political economy and places housing at the center of the financialization debate. It's argued that a global wall of money is looking for a high quality collateral, HQC, investments, and housing is one of the few asset classes considered high quality collateral, presenting a diverse range of case studies from the US, the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Spain. The chapters in this book include coverage of the role of the state as the driver of financialization processes and the part played by local and national histories and institutions. Where housing used to be something local or national, the two-way coupling of housing to finance has been one crucial element in the recent crisis. Due to the financialization of housing in today's markets, housing risks are increasingly becoming financial risks. And Hyla's book is on Singapore, Urban Land Rent Singapore as a Property State. In Urban Land Rent, on Hyla develops an original theory of urban land rent with important implications for urban studies and urban theory. The book is a comprehensive analysis of land rent theory in the modern city, using Singapore as a case study. It examines the question of land from a variety of perspectives as a resource, ideologies, interventions in the land market, actors in the land market, the global scope of land markets and investments in land. In doing so, it details the Asian development state model, historical and contemporary land regimes, public housing models, and the development industry for Singapore and several other cities such as Hong Kong. The book also incorporates discussion of the modern real estate market with reference to real estate investment trusts, the REITs, the sovereign wealth funds investing in real estate. Note, of course, sovereign wealth funds exist in other kinds of countries for other kinds of things, as we noticed with Saudi Arabia, and the fusion between sophisticated financial instruments and real estates. Okay, section 2, comparisons and In chapter one, you criticize comparative housing studies and explanations referring to different national housing systems. Don't you need these studies to be able to argue, as you do, that housing is a central aspect of financialization? Manuel, my problem with comparative housing studies is that a great deal of it does very little comparing and engages mostly in contrasting housing experiences in different countries. Differences are then, quote unquote, explained from specific national trajectories, often in an explicit or implicit path dependent way. But is this really an explanation? Or is it just a description? And is this really a comparison? It seems obvious to me that different countries will have different housing systems, and this is in part a result of past choices. And I think you downplay the role of history. You even write that it is a quote unquote trivial truth that history matters. Manuel, why do we see similar developments in different countries? Why do we see house prices increasing faster than average income or GDP in virtually every country in the last decades? An approach that thinks of comparison as the method to explain differences cannot answer this question. It will focus on the differences and risks, missing out on the bigger picture. I am looking for what Rodrigo Fernandez and I, in Chapter 5, the book, following Colin Hay, 2004, call common trajectories. The idea of a common trajectory is built on the empirical observation that countries move in the same direction, albeit from a different starting point, and maintain their essential institutional differences. And that's actually a very interesting idea. That's a side note in terms of paths and contrasts on a contentious terrain. Let's put it that way. And what do you mean when you say countries move in the same direction and maintain their essential institutions? Well, Manuel, this is about the common trajectories I just mentioned. Take a basic example, the size of national mortgage debt compared to the size of the economy measured in GDP. In the Netherlands, this increased from roughly 70% in 2000 to 110% in 2010, meaning that in 2010, the Dutch mortgage debt was 10% higher than the annual GDP. In Spain, this number went up from 30% in 2000 to 65% in 2010. In other words, mortgage debt increased significantly in both countries, but there was no convergence between the Netherlands and Spain. Yet, both countries move in the same direction, but that doesn't mean that their respective housing systems have become more similar. We see this trend in virtually every country we study. Therefore, we argue that we need to understand housing finance trends in countries in a comparative perspective in which we start from the empirical observation that things seem to be moving in the same direction, but with different start and end positions and at different speeds. So, this is not simply globalization or convergence. That's in two dimensions. It's more three-dimensional in that sense. It's about understanding both the wide variety and the mutual developments. More interesting, of course, is when you compare relative debts to financing and its relation to the regional bank, etc. Manuel, you discussed globalization and introduced the concept of global rent. Is all rent that involves international investment automatically global rent? Doesn't this suggest a very flat ontology of globalization? And responds, the whole idea of the theory of land rent is the separation between the property relations as the necessary condition of the market economy and their manifestations. Land rent is the economic form in which landed property relations are manifested, as an eminent land rent theorist said. The different manifestation forms of land rent are, for example, land price and rental payment. And these are affected by many other factors, such as location and demand. This is no flat ontology. In discussing global rent, I did not focus on international investment, but wanted to explain why housing prices are so high in global cities and who pays these prices. See, Trump Tower. Singapore is a good case to explain this. My Finnish expatriate friends who worked for Nokia paid for their housing 10 times the amount I paid for living in university housing. Transnational companies like Nokia, with their generous housing allowances, paid those rents. Here we also have a case to show how history matters. Without the systematic construction of the public housing sector, the high rents paid by these expatriates would have increased the general housing price level and excluded other groups from the Singapore housing market. Thanks to the provision of public housing, they did not. Note, of course, that this is very complicated in terms of public housing in Singapore, which is a more unique case in terms of the relative amount that the government engages in public housing. Anyway, back to Manuel. It appears as if there are two distinct parts of your book, one about land rent theory, chapters 1 through 4, and one about Singapore, chapters 5 through 8. But do we need the case of Singapore to illustrate land rent theory and the different forms of rent it distinguishes? As a case, what does it contribute to land rent theory? How does it challenge or extend land rent theory? And you must be the only one thinking there are two distinct parts. My book is about a capitalist city in which the land is owned by the state and the state intervenes in this real estate market. I was interested in exploring the role of land in that kind of city, and the theory of land rent provided me a framework to analyze the questions of use, revenue, and fairness. Although the concept of land rent is an abstract concept, I cannot see how one could elaborate the theory of land rent without a case. I do not use Singapore as a case to illustrate the theory as if the theory could exist independently of the social reality it talks about, but to look at in which way the forms and recipients of land rent are entangled today and how they have changed during that history. And here we see an interesting feature of the theory of land rent, explaining also why such an old theory can be relevant still today. First, new versions of the theory have emerged as a solution to contemporary issues concerning, for example, housing or poverty. Now, in the book, I illustrate this quality of the theory by comparing it to Virginia Woolf's Orlando. That alone is an interesting idea. Second, the basic ideas of the theory were already presented at the dawn of capitalism. Smith, Ricardo, and Marx could see the role of landowners in relation to other classes in the context of capitalism. Today, these relations are much more complicated. For example, property owned by REITs, R-E-I-T-S. This is also the reason why I developed various categories of land rent. These forms are tools to unveil the unjust landed property under them. Unjust landed property. I said already that land rent is the economic form in which landed property relations are manifested. The Singapore case is to apply and develop the theory in the context of state land ownership. Manuel, you show that the Singapore model of land ownership and development developed under very specific circumstances, both politically and materially. It also didn't develop from a blueprint. What you call land institutions in Chapter 5 not only shaped, but co-developed with the Singapore model. That's the beauty of choosing, in fact, the Singapore model. And you are correct in remarking, that the circumstances in Singapore were specific both materially and politically. The material condition is the fate of being a city-state. It's one of the very unique things about Singapore, without natural resources to develop industries. This scarcity had to be compensated, and here the political comes into the picture. The founding fathers of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee, studied at London School of Economics and listened to the lectures by Harold Laski and were influenced by Fabian socialists, who were influenced by, Henry George. I do not know whether the success of Singapore came as a surprise, but the important thing that I show in the book is the relationship of this success to a cunning construction of land institutions. Here we have history again. Manuel, is it possible to replicate the Singapore model, and if so, under what conditions? And this question has been asked several times. My book is not about the Singapore model. It can be used as a best practice. The book is to investigate the land ownership in the case of Singapore, for example, in public housing. And here we see the relevance of quote-unquote land institutions. In Singapore, they're woven into an effective network that has the function of hindering land speculation. because there's not much of it. And land speculation, as I argue in the book, is the main reason for unaffordable housing. If there are some lessons to be drawn from the study of Singapore, it is a call to consider land hoarding, speculation, and land rent as obstacles to solving the housing question. In addition to this call for a systematic land policy, a strange lesson Singapore gives is to solve the housing question by making workers homeowners. Ha! The third lesson is that the development industry benefits if the land is owned by the state. The conditions were specific, and analyzing these from the perspective of political economy shows what is unique and what is general in the Singapore case, political economy. And now, you say that you approach the housing question from a perspective of political economy and repeatedly claim that, quote, housing is central to the real world political economy, but remains peripheral to academic political economy, unquote. Now, I think this is not quite correct. For example, Matthew Adel, the late Matthew Adel, in several of his publications has studied the housing question, homeownership, and working class, housing prices, and even housing and financial capital from the perspective of political economy. Manuel, the easy answer would be that one swallow doesn't make summer. In other words, the fact that Adel has looked at these connections does not mean housing is no longer peripheral to academic political economy. In fact, in chapter 2, Brett Christophers, yes, the great Brett Christophers, and I discuss a great deal of literature that makes the connections between housing and political economy. Notwithstanding the existence of this literature, I think that we can conclude that housing is not central to the empirical research or theorizing of political economists. This is beginning to change with the work of people like Herman Schwartz, Lynn Seabrook, Colin Crouch, and others. In a way, also Thomas Piketty. And I'm hoping my book will contribute to this emerging literature as well. Let me correct what I just said. Housing is re-emerging as a topic worthy of political economic analysis. In the 1970s and 1980s, it's more common for the two to be united. Look at the work of David Harvey, Michael Ball, or the early work of Richard Florida. No comment on the late work of Richard Florida. Anyway, Anne replies, Matthew Adel was not a lonely swallow. There were several others. For example, Simon Clark and Norman Ginsberg, Kristen Topolov, Marino Follin, and of course, David Harvey. Doreen Massey and Alexandra Catalano, already in Capital and Land in 1978, distinguished financial land ownership as one type of land ownership. I think one should also look at this literature, not only contemporary writings, if one analyzes housing from the point of view of political economy. And there seems to be a rather big difference between the approach of these scholars and your analysis. They included an analysis of land in their housing studies, whereas you focus on money. Like these scholars, I see the approach of political economy broader, including, for example, an analysis of land and land rent. Manuel, I agree that land is fundamental, but one of the most interesting discoveries in writing this book was that land is not that important in explaining the differences and similarities between the trajectories of housing financialization. Mind you, I'm not saying land is not important, just not a key factor in understanding what I wanted to focus on. Take the issue of housing construction. To explain house price development, both housing economists and the popular media typically look at housing construction as well as the number of housing units compared to population size. The general idea is that increasing house prices reflect the lack of housing supply. My argument is that house prices are not primarily driven by the development of the demand and supply of housing units, although they can surely make a difference of secondary order, but rather by the demand and supply of finance to both housing consumers, primarily in the form of mortgage loans, and housing producers through a range of financial instruments to real estate developers, construction firms, and different types of landlords. Housing and money prices. And so you explain housing prices by referring to demand and supply of finance. What differentiates you from monetarists who, like you, argue for the importance of the quantity of money? Manuel, it is definitely true that there's a strong focus on money, or more precise, finance. The book is titled, The Financialization of Housing for a reason. However, I don't think this is a monetarist perspective. It's not only about the supply of money by central banks, but about why and how finance seeps, or more correctly, pours into housing. This is why the opening paragraph of the concluding chapter is as follows, quote, a global wall of money is looking for high quality collateral HQC investments, and housing is one of the few asset classes considered HQC. This explains why housing is increasingly becoming financialized, but it does not explain the timing, politics, and geography. And I think explanation needs something more than just saying that housing can be used as high quality collateral. Manuel, the empirical evidence invalidates the economic maxim that oversupply must lead to declining prices and that rising prices are a result of undersupply. We see that house prices go up in countries where new construction is several times as high as new household formation, like Spain and Ireland, but that this is also true in countries with low numbers of new construction, like the UK and the Netherlands. It's not primarily about land and construction, it's about the supply of money. House prices did not skyrocket because demand increases faster than supply, although this can be a contributing factor. But because the supply of money directed towards housing went up, irrespective of the demand for either housing or money. Now, for example, if the price of money, for example, the interest rate, is low enough, it will be used either to construct, develop, buy up, rent out, sell, or buy housing. In the age of financialized capitalism, house prices are primarily, but never exclusively, driven by the supply of housing finance. Even when with relatively stable populations and income levels, it is not merely possible, but highly likely that house prices will go up if the supply of housing finance goes up. And so, house prices are primarily driven by the supply of housing finance, and today, because of the low interest rate for housing loans, we see rising prices. Who benefits from this? And do higher housing prices create housing wealth? Manuel, in chapter 4, I analyzed how privatized Keynesianism, a phrase coined by Colin Crouch in 2009, was introduced in the years following the Great Moderation, a period that economists think of one of stable growth and convergence, but which in fact was the beginning of the quote unquote great excess, in which income and wealth inequality in many countries increased rapidly, as Thomas Piketty has demonstrated. The lack of real income growth was matched with a rapid rise in household debt, and in particular mortgage debt for the middle and to some extent lower classes. The financial crisis and its aftermath have challenged the security of both homeownership and subsidized rental housing. What is known in the policy and academic literature as quote unquote asset-based welfare, unquote, is a very thinly disguised neoliberal and financialized discourse that is mobilized to break down welfare and replace it with housing wealth. Now, instead, it should be labeled asset-based wealth rather than asset-based welfare, as I argue in the concluding chapter. Betting on housing wealth is also a very risky option, as the benefits of homeownership are extremely skewed in terms of location, class, gender, generation, and ethnicity. See the important work of Oliver and Shapiro or of Susan Smith and colleagues. Moreover, putting all your eggs in one basket, housing investment tends to crowd out other investments, as Pierre Bourdieu observed in 1990, is the opposite of spreading risk by spreading investments over different assets, markets, and locations. The question is, how do higher house prices create housing wealth, and for whom? The last part of the question is easy. Higher house prices primarily create housing wealth for those who already own a house. And since rental prices are, at least in part, related to house prices, this also benefits those landlords that are legally able to increase rents. Now, of course, this also implies that those who do not own a house and those who are faced with increasing rents are the losers in the housing game. Even if their income goes up, they may not be able to buy a house. In many housing markets, the common knowledge is that the longer you wait, the more expensive houses will become. Family, class, and geography all matter and interact in unique ways, resulting in a concentration of most of the housing wealth in the hands of a select set of families and the exclusion of many other families from the opportunity not simply to create housing wealth on paper, but to realize real housing wealth. In reality, what is created is the shifting of wealth between families, classes, and locations, or in other words, the workings of the housing market and the tendency towards house price inflation under a regime of financialized capitalism reproduce uneven development and class inequality. Financialization. And you argue that housing is a central aspect of financialization. What is the evidence for this claim, Manuel? Now, the focus on housing rather than on other sectors has several reasons. Let me try to summarize them very briefly. Firstly, housing is one of the few sectors that directly connects the global political economy of finance to the fate of households. Secondly, the lion's share of banks' lending activities these days is on real estate, in particular residential real estate, as opposed to commercial, for example. Third, housing, together with sovereign debt, is a key source of high quality collateral for institutional investors. As the combined capital of institutional investors grows faster than global GDP and sovereign debt from most countries rated as low risk is not increasing, the need for housing as collateral has increased and continues to increase. See Chapter 5. In other words, housing is not simply yet another domain of financialization. Well, yes and no. Anyway, in terms of size and impact, it is the key domain of financialization. In that sense, the notion of housing-centered financialization is not only a conceptual tool, but also an empirical reality. And you're right. Those housing segments and submarkets will financialize that are able to financialize. Can you explain what does this able to financialize mean? Manuel, the devil is in the detail here. In the concluding chapter, I write, under conditions of financialized capitalism, those housing segments and submarkets will financialize that are able to financialize or that are enabled, i.e., made to financialize. Financialization is not a natural phenomenon. It's strongly influenced by context drivers. There are not only geographies of financialization, but also politics of financialization. For example, mortgage securitization is neither a given nor natural. Rather, it is enabled by the actions of both public and private actors. Private actors, such as lenders interested in securitizing their loans of investment banks interested in the fees they can charge for handling securitization operations, may lobby actors within the state to excuse me, may lobby actors within the state to adopt regulation, that is, to enable mortgage securitization through the expansion of financial regulation rather than deregulation. We've seen that even in a context where the owner-occupied housing market is hardly financialized, the rental housing markets may be pressured to financialize separately or selectively. In Germany, for example, the long-term stability of house prices is quite remarkable, but different segments of the rental housing market did financialize rapidly because it was enabled to financialize. This makes Germany exceptional and generic at the same time. Whereas Whereas an analysis of the German mortgage and owner-occupied markets might conclude that the German housing market is not financialized, those analyzing the social and private rental markets would come to very different conclusions. It would be incorrect to conclude that Germany is not financializing because it is not financializing like the US, the UK, or some other country, which is why Gertjan Weiberg and I speak of the alternative financialization of the German housing market. Manuel, you discuss financialization and introduce the concept of derivative rent. Now, what is derivative rent? How is it different from other forms of rent? Like, is it differential? If derivative rent is of a speculative nature, you implicitly suggest other forms of rent are not. Can you elaborate on this? And land speculation is one of the main topics of the book. Chapter 6 on developers, for example, discusses extensively speculation, and the concept of absolute rent refers to a withholding and hoarding type of speculation. The concept of derivative rent Derivative rent refers to another kind of speculation, that is, comparing the yield from land titles securitized and packed together with mortgages compared with the yield of shares and stocks. This type of speculation has very harmful effects on the built environment, the state, and regulation. Next. Manuel, you argue that Singapore is a property state, but you don't really explain what you mean by a property state. In 2000, this journal published an article in which you argued that both Singapore and Hong Kong are property states and developed the concept. Why did you keep the concept from the 2000 article but not its conceptualization? In the book, the concept provides flavor, but conceptually, you appear to prefer regime of regulation public rent or simply land regime and land institutions. Why has the concept of property state fallen out of favor, but did you keep it as the book's subtitle? And in the book, compared with the article, there's more detailed empirical analysis and several comparisons. I analyze the institutions, actors, and policies in Singapore, look at the historical development of land institutions and landed property, show how the provision of public housing was gradually extended to more than 80% of the population, analyze development companies and their relationship to the state, and discuss public revenue. All these actors, institutions, revenues, and so on are features of the property state. The book also places the Singapore property state on the map of historical land regimes and philosophies of property by discussing enclosure movements in Europe and philosophers such as Locke, Rousseau, and Kant. All these discussions give a more comprehensive picture of the property state. Manuel, both Singapore and Hong Kong are city-states as well as secondary global cities. Is it possible to conceive of property states in other circumstances? Do these need to be city-states, or could they be larger countries as well? And if so, do they need to be spearheaded by a city-state? And there are two features that characterize both Singapore and Hong Kong, as I discuss in Chapter 6. First, they derive a considerable amount of revenue from land and real estate. Second, in these city-states, there's no need to redistribute this revenue and subsidize underdeveloped hinterland. The question here for other cities, whether city-states or not, is that they can tax real estate. Now, this may sound trivial in countries where real estate taxes have a long history. However, in some countries, like in Finland, the amount of real estate taxes in public revenue is very small. Today, when real estate is increasingly owned by professional investors like REITs, REITs, and the rentier class captures the benefits from rising real estate prices, cities should increase their real estate taxes. In this sense, we can perhaps say that there is a tendency of cities becoming property states. However, a lesson the property state of Singapore gives is to intervene and regulate the real estate market. And I am surprised you did not ask me about regulation, because you also discuss regulation, but you talk about regulated deregulation, Chapter 7 in particular. What do you mean by this? Manuel, deregulation is not a clearly defined term, mostly serving to encompass, quote unquote, the opposite of regulation. In economics and popular media, regulation is seen as anything that limits the workings of market mechanism. To most mainstream economists, regulation has a negative connotation. It's only deemed beneficial if it addresses market failures. Political economists generally use a more open definition of regulation and argue that the state principally shapes, not simply constrains, markets. Capitalism is furthered through regulation. Because of the multiple meanings associated with the term deregulation, I've proposed this alternative concept. The deregulation part of it refers to deregulation as liberalization, that is, giving some economic agents greater freedom from state control and legal restrictions, while the regulated part refers to, quote, setting rules and establishing an enforcement mechanism designed to control the operation of the system's constituent institutions, instruments, and markets, unquote. In other words, under regulated deregulation, some economic agents are given greater freedom from state control, but the market framework itself is regulated. In fact, and let me break here for a second. And yes, that does happen, right? Offsets, set-asides, etc. In fact, regulation gives some economic agents this freedom, typically at the expense of other agents. The concept of regulated deregulation enables us to see how liberalization of selective economic agents was only made possible by the introduction of a new regulatory system that replaced or amended the existing one. Regulated deregulation allows for the combination of competition and economic incentives on the one hand, and the coordination and regulatory authority-led making and the shaping of different economic sectors and industries. As I argue in the concluding chapter, the state actively, but not always consciously, creates the conditions for the financialization of housing and other asset sectors and markets. The state is not withdrawing, but rather being restructured in a way that favors the interest of others, some large financialized corporations, at the expense of others. You could see that in Michael Hudson describing some of the work during the 2008 crisis. Regulation is not being repealed to make the market mechanism function more smoothly. It is introduced to create new markets that end up looking nothing like the level playing field utopias espoused by neoliberal economists, think tanks, lobbyists, and politicians. And can you give me an example of what this new regulatory system looks like, Manuel? Okay, let's take the regulation of American and British housing finance, which demonstrates that forms of regulation facilitate markets at least as much as they constrain them. Authors using the term deregulation often focus on the repeal of such acts as Glass-Steagall in the US, but pay less attention to all the new and expanded regulation that has replaced it. In fact, regulation in most markets is actually increasing and often at a rapid pace, tempting Levy Faurer in 2005 to speak of a regulatory explosion. New regulation tends to be more specific, more detailed, and therefore complex. There is also a tendency for formal laws and acts to be complemented by massive volumes of different types of regulation, bylaws, statutes, ordinances, controls, codes, rules, principles, and standards, which are all increasingly institutionalized in law. And compared with my discussion about the property state, you do not talk much about the state and its institutions, for example, central banks and fiscal and financial policies. Manuel, I don't think it's correct to say that I don't talk much about the state. In fact, the role of the state is highlighted in every chapter. In general terms, the state is often the driver of financialization processes, for example, by pushing families into housing debt, by enabling financial institutions to buy up subsidized housing, or by simply withdrawing from providing or regulating the housing sector and opening up the field to rent-seeking financial institutions. It's almost impossible to come up with a list of how I include the state in my analysis because the entire book is saturated with it. To start with, there is the idea of regulated deregulation that we have just discussed. I mobilized this concept of regulated deregulation to show how, for example, mortgage securitization, but also housing privatization were state-led developments, Chapter 7. Brett Christophers and I also discussed the role of the state in making the twin institutions of private property and home ownership, including its fiscal treatment, chapters 2 and 4, as well as in creating a modern mortgage market through a range of policy initiatives by the U.S. federal government between the 1930s and the 21st century. Furthermore, in chapter 4, I tie housing to austerity and privatize Keynesianism. And in chapter 5, Rodrigo Fernandez and I discuss the role of central banks in not only the supply of money, but also the way their policies favor investment in housing. What's different between your book and mine is that your book focuses on one particular country, while mine presents a more general argument that is illustrated through data and examples from various countries. And I think your last sentence shows a difference between our methodology and epistemology we have encountered already before. You generalize from similar developments in different countries, whereas I, like Ben Feifberg, think that generalization is only one of many ways by which people gain and accumulate knowledge. Case studies can also contribute knowledge accumulation. Some scholars may even agree with John Walton, who wrote, quote, case studies are likely to produce the best theory, unquote. Further, I think generalizations need explanation, and I'm also interested in a genetic explanation referring to historical development. As I said already, my book is about a capitalist city, Singapore, in which the land is owned by the state, and the state regulates the real estate market. Its general argument concerns such conditions of property and this type of the state. I do not generalize from empirical data, but analyze the relationships and mechanisms and focus on the institutions and policies of the state. For example, in Chapter 8, the policy of the monetary authority of Singapore, that is, Singapore's central bank. I think showing such mechanisms is at least as convincing as demonstrating general trends. Actually, this is quite a useful little article because it does describe the difference between, generalization and particulars, the problem of doing that. It also identifies the issue of case study selection, which for some folks is never comparative, but is rather, sort of drills down as a kind of a grounded study or deep structure, and that's sort of interesting as well, just from a methodological point of view. So that's why I chose this article. It covers a wide range of things, including not only structural models, generally left models. Didn't have to talk about Marx, even though it's mentioned once. Um, Singapore is interesting because it is, with respect, has a modicum of authoritarianism in how it operates, or a single party rule, among other things, and an interesting set of regulatory policies where, as hard as they may, they still can't control certain kinds of crime. So it's quite amusing in that kind of historical sense. Even more amusing, of course, for it to be chosen as a site for in the first Trump term for Trump to meet with Kim Jong Un in Singapore, among of a variety of places they could have met. So that's also very interesting, but maybe only a side light. So I have included this article. I've done this article today to give you a kind of flavor for kind of where I'm headed with that. It's not necessarily about rent, but it is also to look at the larger question of financialization within, the context of a kind of modern period where you have this kind of fractures within a neoliberal or neoliberal economies. And you can see how there's a kind of churning in the methodology that implies that we have fractures and crisis and all those other good things that need to be sort of dealt with in that context. Um, I include this table from the next article, and it is kind of there are a whole slew of differential monopoly and absolute rent, or differential rent one and two, and a monopoly rent form, which is often not mentioned in the literature for a variety of reasons, and absolute rent, all of which are interesting problems, some of which are emphasized, whether they are for or against their detriment is another case, but rent does have this kind of categorization issue. So this is from a virtual special issue editorial essay, This Shitty Rent Business, the shitty rent business, as a quote from Marx. What's the point of land rent theory? And needless to say, this is something that Marx worries about. And so anyway, Manuel Albers is also conjoined in this article. So there is a kind of overflow or conjoining of the two articles. In this introduction to a virtual special issue on land rent, we sketch out the history of land rent theory, encompassing classical political economy, Marx's political economy, the marginalist turn and subsequent foundations for urban economics, and the Marxist consensus around rent theory during geography's spatial turn. Now, one could say that all spatial turns are geographic, but that's another story. We then overview some of the contemporary strands of literature that have developed since the breakdown of this consensus, namely political economy approaches centered on, now this is important areas, right? Capital switching, institutionalism of various stripes. Remember, we've been looking at institutionalism in a variety of cases. the Richard T. Ely is just a really fascinating example in context of the history of institutionalism before the new institutionalism came along and the rent gap theory. We offer a critical urban political economy perspective and a particular set of arguments run through the review. First, land is not the same as capital, but has unique attributes as a factor of production which require a separate theorization. Second, since the 1970s consensus around land rent in the city dissipated, the critical literature has tended to take the question of why and how the payment exists at all for granted and has ignored the particular dynamics of rent arising from the idiosyncrasies of land. Amongst the talk of an Anthropocene and planetary urbanization, it's surprising that the economic fulcrum of the capitalist remaking of geography has fallen so completely off the agenda. It is time to bring rent back into the analysis of land, cities, and capitalism. So, provocative elements of an abstract. Needless to say, David Harvey is part of this as well. So, Marx, in correspondence with Engels, says, incidentally, another thing I've been last able to sort out is this shitty rent business. I had long harbored misgivings as to the absolute correctness of Ricardo's theory and have at length got to the bottom of the swindle. So, and this is, needless to say, a very famous quote. And that it occurs somewhere between 1860 and 1864 is also useful in terms of the evolution of capital, the text, and the position in terms of the manuscripts. That is the difference between 1859 and 60, or 60 and 63, or 64 through 67, blah, 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 blah. Okay, introduction. In a letter to Engels recounting the misery of his family's impoverishment, Marx found an unlikely reason for optimism in land rent theory, pronouncing that he'd last been able to sort out the shitty rent business. One would not begrudge a desperate man even the most unlikely source of succor, yet the subsequent century of economic thought has shown land rent to be anything but sorted out. Confusion and conflict has reigned throughout, and today the topic is largely neglected in the social sciences, except as a set of inherited assumptions in the models of urban economists, or a heuristic for the idiosyncratic analyses of just some Marxists. That's not to say that the issues surrounding land rent have disappeared. They're central to many key contemporary topics in urban studies, such as we just discussed, the financialization of land, the dynamics of house prices, the governance of urban infrastructure, land grabs. Land grabs are very big these days, as you may have noticed, expulsions, gentrification, and redlining, to name but a few. Yet, even as interest in these issues has intensified, their political economic kernel, that is, land rent, has been black boxed, as many researchers have either turned away from political economy approaches in general, or simply found little applicability from the imposing esoteric debates in the rent theory literature. The aim of this virtual special issue is to clarify the raison d'etre of a theory of rent and encourage debate around its uses. First, a definition of terms. Land rent is a payment made to landlords for the right to use land and its appurtenances. It is the total rent paid. Ground rent is the rent paid for the use of the land minus that paid for the fixed capital on the land, that is, the buildings and other appurtenances. The distinction itself is not crucial to our discussion, and we use the terms interchangeably, but properly speaking, discussions on rent theory pertain to ground rent because the part afforded to buildings and their appurtenances is usually considered a straightforward return on capital invested. Similarly, land values and the land market fall under the purview of rent theory because the value of land is held to be the result of its estimated rental value over the future, usually a period of 2 or 3 decades, 30-year mortgage, etc. Ground rent, then, is seen as the major determinant of both the contracted rent paid by tenants and the land's purchase price. Much of the focus of neoclassical theories of rent, and to some extent approaches in geography since the spatial turn, has been on spatial differences in land price. However, the overarching problem requiring a theory of rent is not this, but that of explaining the existence of ground rent at all. Why does land command large values? The largest portion, which cannot be attributed to labor or interest on capital investment, but seemingly appears for nothing. The attempt to account for this payment generates a corresponding problematic, of which spatial differentiation is a part. In her insuperable review of the topic, Anne Hyla, recall from above, asserts that a theory of rent broaches one or more of three questions. The first question is, how does the substance of rent emerge? Number two, B, who or what are its agents? What are the behavioral patterns and mutual social relations? For example, who receives the rent? And three, or C, what is the economic role of rent? For example, what is its role in accumulation and coordination? So this idea of capitalist accumulation, ultimately questions of power. In our view, these questions are of themselves important enough to justify a pursuit of rent theory. Yet in the quarter century since Hyla offered this outline and called for a modern theory of rent, the trend has been one of neglect, punctuated by isolated calls for a revival amongst critical scholars. And you can see there's a considerable list of folks here, winding up, of course, with some people who are really quite strict about urban economics. But anyway, what remains to be demonstrated, perhaps, is not only that the questions themselves are significant, but also the efficacy of extant rent theory in answering them, and the explanatory power of these answers in understanding the geographies of capitalism. In this introduction to a virtual special issue on land rent, we sketch out the history of rent theory encompassing classical political economy, Marxist political economy, the marginalist turn and foundations of urban economics, and the Marxist revival of rent theory during geography's spatial turn. We then overview some of the strands of literature that have been prominent since the breakdown of this consensus in political economy approaches centered on capital switching, institutionalism of various stripes, and the rent gap theory. We offer a critical urban political economy perspective on the topic, highlighting three problems hampering a full political economic theorization of rent. First is a tendency in recent critical literature to ignore Hyla's first question of the emergence of rent and focus only on Hyla's second question, the nature and operation of the actors of rent. By thus taking the question of why we pay rent at all as unproblematic and ignoring the particular dynamics of rent that the idiosyncrasies of land imbue it with, the contemporary critical literature risks reproducing the conflation of land and capital that underpins many of the contradictions of capitalist urbanism. That's, Harvey on the limits of capital. This needs to be addressed with a robust theorization of the categories of rent and of the features of land as a primary factor of production. Remember, land, labor, and capital. Second, the critical literature on rent has eschewed a theorization of the bid rent function, but in doing so loses the conceptual grounding with which to build a non-functionalist theory of land markets and their role in the capitalist coordination of space. That's a very big area because of theories of bid rent being perhaps over functionalized, let's put it that way. Because of some concepts of center periphery or whatever. Third, absolute rent has been rejected in the literature, but should be the basis of a critical theory of monopolies. Indeed, it should. Indeed, as the form of rent that arises only through the violence of asserting property rights or class position, this category should not only be rehabilitated, but requires extension beyond land to an increasingly extractive financialized capitalism rife with distributional conflicts. And this is an interesting kind of issue because then you need to actually particularize certain elements of what is being rented, let's put it that way. The roots of a problem, classical rent theory. For the French physiocrats and Adam Smith, land rent is the price paid for the value contributed by nature itself. However, maintaining that land is the source of value is incompatible with the labor theories of value, which prevailed in classical political economy, not just Marx or Ricardo, etc. A labor theory of value holds that the economic value of a commodity depends on how much labor must be spent in order to produce it. Now, it follows from this theory that land cannot command a value in itself, as it is permanent and does not require labor to produce. Darn that soil. Ricardo's solution was to bring rent theory into accordance with the labor theory of value using the notion of differential rent. Differential rent was first formulated by James Anderson, 1777, in his assertion that rent derives from differences in fertility of the soil, which therefore determine the profitability of a farmer using a particular plot. The landlord's claim is her claim on the increased profitability that results from using her plot of land over others. As such, a differential rent entails only a redistribution of the profits. Rent is in an ingenious contrivance for equalizing the profits to be drawn from fields of different degrees of fertility and of local circumstances, as Anderson says. As such, if no rent were charged, the price of the commodity would be unaffected. The tenant farmer would simply not have to share her profits. Now, for Ricardo, labor is the only source of value as a factor affecting how much labor must be applied in order to produce the commodity, with differential rates being derived from the advantage that a particular plot of land holds over inferior plots. Ricardo held rents to be determined by the fertility of marginal land in cultivation. That is, the least profitable land that is in use, the amount of land in use being determined by demand. Such marginal land commands no rent, but forms a sort of baseline. Any fertility above this level is a productivity gain due to the land and taken by the landlord as a condition of the farmer's access to it. Ricardo's theory can be regarded as the definitive classical political economy statement on rent and is the departure point for neoclassical economics and Marxist theory, the two dominant approaches to the subject. The next section is on Marx's theory of rent, and I note at the current moment that I've exceeded my allocated time. So I'm going to suspend this and remind you that there is a significant amount further to go in this article. And this, I think we may put this off till Monday to complete it. If not, you have the entire article before you to sort of fiddle with. Let me see if there are any trenchant comments. Yes, I'm hopeful that Joe will return. I will thank people for their attention. Return us to the live stream or stop the share, and then I will return to kill the live stream. Live stream is being killed. This has been 23 May, dis&datInformation. We've been discussing, among many other things, land rent, but in a sort of a new pitch, as it were, to fill in some of the gaps that we've had relative to classical theories of rent, neoclassical and Marxist and heterodox approaches to issues of rent, because it is problematic, particularly under conditions of financialization and its various representations. That is, housing is one example of among many, and it doesn't have to be that, and which require a redefinition, one would hope, of certain commodity notions or money commodity notions. So all of that's there in terms of extending a certain type of thinking about capital. So that's that. Tomorrow, we've been doing attending class Unity on Sundays, and that's at 2 p.m. And you may go to the classunity.org site to see the current new class, which has only just begun, so you really haven't gotten behind, on the war economy. And yes, military Keynesianism is not, it also is about land and rent seeking in a wholly different, well, not wholly different, but a different way. And particularly in the American context. So there's that. That's Sunday at 2 p.m. Other things are occurring, of course, on Sunday that include Star Trek: The Next Generation. Tomorrow is a showing in after we fiddle with other matters. Will be a showing, I think, at 7 um, on Saturday of The Killers, for which I'm trying to lobby for showing not only original 1946 version, but the 1964 version of The Killers at some moment. I'd love to show them one after another. That would be even more amusing, but it's only amusing to people like me. Um, and tomorrow, that is Saturday, the 24th of May, I expect to do at 2 p.m. Simply because I have nothing better to do. It's, we will be doing weekly marks, and as usual, and rather than what we've normally been doing on Saturday, and that is theories of surplus value, we will try and finish up, as far as I can remember it, um, chapter 24 of the 2024 new edition, the Princeton University edition, done by the two Pauls of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1. And I will yammer on about that and read that. We're almost done with that, although I think that will take 2 weeks because chapter 25 is also a little slightly lengthy. So all that's coming up ahead. That is, and later tonight will be a night gallery um, after hours, which starts at 7 o'clock, which is in 53 minutes from now. So hopefully you'll want to stick around. The night gallery comes half an hour after that, and then I think we're looking at something else tonight, but I cannot remember only because I there are too many little thoughts in my very small brain. So now I'm going to shut off the live stream and return you to your regularly scheduled